The alarm cut through the metal hallway like a blade before I even opened my eyes. I was chained to a bench inside a prisoner transport pod, my wrists locked behind me, my breath fogging in the cold air of the ship. Red light pulsed across the walls. Somewhere ahead, someone was screaming. My name is Ethan Hale. 3 months ago I was a soldier. Now I was cargo. One more human body being moved from one alien holding block to another. Part of the defeated remainder of a war humanity had lost before I ever understood how big the universe really was. The pod jerked hard to the side. Metal groaned. Through the small viewport I saw sparks jumping from a wall panel, and then I saw them. 3 prisoners from the cell block ahead of mine, free of their restraints, moving fast toward the front of the transport where the guards were stationed. One of them had a guard's stun baton in his hand. This was not supposed to happen. Transport pods were supposed to be secure. Someone had planned this. The guards nearest me, tall figures in dark armor with faces like sharpened glass, turned to face the threat, weapons rising. But they were not alone in that hallway. Between them and the escaping prisoners stood a smaller figure, dressed not in armor but in flowing violet robes stitched with silver thread, her white hair pulled back in a braid that fell past her shoulder. She had stepped out of a side chamber at exactly the wrong moment, and now she stood frozen between 2 groups of very dangerous people. I did not know her name yet. I only knew, in that instant, that she was about to be caught in the middle of a fight that had nothing to do with her. The prisoner with the stun baton saw her too. His eyes changed. A hostage was worth more than a fight. I do not remember deciding to move. I remember the chain around my wrists, snapping taut against the bench bolt, old and half-rusted from years of transporting bodies that no one bothered to maintain properly, and I remember throwing my whole weight backward until the bolt gave way with a crack. Then I was on my feet, chain still hanging from my wrists, and I was running. The guards were too far. The prisoner was too close to her. I was the only one in position. I hit him from the side before he could raise the baton, driving my shoulder into his ribs and taking us both to the floor. The baton skittered away across the metal deck. He was bigger than me, stronger too, and his elbow caught me across the jaw hard enough that my vision went white for half a second. But I had done this kind of fighting before, in mud and rain on a planet far from here, and my body remembered what my mind could not fully process yet. I got my chained wrists around his throat from behind, and held on until the guards finally reached us and pulled him off. When I looked up, breathing hard, blood in my mouth, she was staring at me. Her eyes were a pale gold color I had never seen on a human face, and there was no fear in them anymore, only a sharp, calculating attention, like she was reading something written on my skin. The guards moved to restrain the other 2 prisoners. One of them stepped toward me with a weapon raised, ready to put me back in my place for daring to stand without permission. She raised one hand, and he stopped immediately. "Leave him," she said. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried the kind of weight that made armored men freeze mid-motion. "He just saved my life. You may thank him by not putting a weapon in his face." The guard lowered his weapon, though his expression made clear he did not like it. She stepped closer to me, careful of the chain still dangling from my wrists, and studied my face the way someone studies a puzzle they did not expect to find interesting. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ethan," I said. "Ethan Hale." "Ethan Hale," she repeated, testing the sound of it. "You moved before my own guards did. Why?" I did not have a clever answer. I still do not think there was one. "You were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time," I said. "Somebody had to do something." Something flickered behind her eyes, amusement maybe, or recognition. She turned to the guard captain, a broad-shouldered woman with silver markings along her jaw. "This is the one," she said. "Release him from the general holding manifest. He comes with me." The captain's mouth tightened. "Your Highness, he is an enemy combatant, recently captured. We know nothing about him." "I know enough," the woman in violet said. "I know he ran toward danger instead of away from it. For a stranger who owes him nothing, that tells me more than any file could." That was the first time I heard the word Highness attached to her, and the first time I understood that the woman I had just tackled a man to protect was not simply a passenger on this transport. She was Isara Vel, second daughter of the ruling house of the Caliph Empire, heir to a throne that half her own court did not want her to sit on. I did not know any of that yet, standing there with chains hanging from my wrists and blood on my lip. I only knew that the guards were undoing my restraints, and that the princess of an alien empire was looking at me like I was the answer to a question she had been asking for a long time. They took me to a private chamber deep inside the transport, far from the other prisoners, and for the first time since my capture, no one put a weapon near my head while I ate. Isara sat across from me, watching, while a servant brought food I did not recognize, and water that tasted faintly of something sweet. "You are wondering why I did not simply let my guards handle it," she said. I was, though I had not planned to say so out loud. "My guards are loyal to the crown," she said, "which is not the same as being loyal to me. There is a difference between defending a title and defending a person. I have learned, painfully, that most of the people sworn to protect me are protecting the idea of the empire, not the woman who happens to be standing in its way. If something happens to me, another heir takes my place, and the empire continues exactly as it did before. My death costs them very little." "That's a grim way to live," I said. "It is a survivable way to live," she answered, "which is more than I can say for the alternative." She leaned forward slightly, studying me again with that same sharp attention. "You have no faction here, no family in my court, no debts, no allies, no enemies among my people. You are, in every sense that matters, an outsider, which means you have nothing to gain by seeing me removed, and nothing to lose by keeping me alive except your own effort. You're saying you trust me because I have no reason to care about your politics. I am saying, I trust you because you already proved, on instinct, before you knew who I was, that you would put yourself between me and danger. That is worth more to me than any oath sworn by someone raised in this court to say pretty words they do not mean." I sat back, turning the water cup slowly between my hands. "And if I say no, if I tell you I just want to go back to whatever cell you were sending me to and wait out the rest of this war, then I will have my guards return you there, and I will not hold it against you," she said simply. "I am not going to force loyalty from a man in chains. That is exactly the kind of empty loyalty I am trying to avoid." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the cell waiting for me if I said no, the years of nothing, the slow disappearance of a person inside 4 gray walls. I thought about the way she had stood frozen in that hallway, not because she was weak, but because for one unguarded second, she had simply been a person caught in the wrong place. I thought about how easily that could have gone differently if I had hesitated even a second longer. "What would you need from me?" I asked, "if I said yes?" "A guard," she said. "Not one who answers to my court, or my captains, or my mother's council. One who answers only to me. Someone close enough to see the things my own advisors miss, because you were not raised inside this palace, trained to look away from certain truths the way everyone else here has been. I do not need another sword with my house's colors on it. I need eyes that see clearly. And if I fail," I said, "if something happens to you while I'm supposed to be watching," her expression did not change, but something in her voice did, quieter now, more certain. "Then it happens the way it would have happened anyway, except that this time, someone actually tried." I thought about my chances back in that cell. I thought about the alternative, standing beside someone who had just seen me as a person before she had learned my name, in a palace full of enemies I did not yet understand. "All right," I said, "I'll do it." She studied me for another moment, then extended her hand, palm up, in a gesture I did not recognize. "In my language, there is a word for what I am asking of you. It does not translate perfectly. The closest meaning is something like an unbreakable promise, a vow that does not end when the danger ends, or when the reward runs out, or when it becomes difficult. Say the words after me, if you accept." She spoke a short phrase in her own language, syllables sharp and layered in a way my mouth was not built for. I repeated it back, clumsy, mispronounced, probably closer to nonsense than to whatever she had actually said, but she did not laugh, and she did not correct me. She simply nodded, once, like something important had just been settled. "From this moment," she said, switching back to words I understood, "you are bound to my safety before your own. Do you understand what you have just agreed to?" I did not fully, not yet. I would not understand the true weight of that vow until the following night, when the palace around us would fill with smoke and blood and betrayal, and I would have to decide exactly how far I was willing to go to keep the promise I had just made to a woman I had known for less than an hour. But in that quiet chamber, with the transport humming steadily beneath us and the chains finally gone from my wrists, I said the only thing that felt true. "I understand enough," I said. "I won't let anything happen to you." She almost smiled then, the first real crack in that careful, guarded expression. "We will see, Ethan Hale," she said. "By morning, we will see exactly what your word is worth." I did not know it then, but she had already chosen the exact night that promise would be tested. The palace of House Vel rose out of the mountainside, like something grown rather than built, towers of pale stone twisting upward into a sky that never turned fully dark on this world. My new quarters were small, a single room beside Isara's chambers, close enough that I could reach her door in 3 steps if I needed to. I did not sleep well that first night. I kept waiting for someone to walk through that door and tell me the whole arrangement had been a mistake. No one did. By the second morning, I understood that surviving in this palace required a different kind of fighting than anything I had learned on a battlefield. There were no obvious enemies here, no uniforms marking friend from foe. Everyone smiled, everyone bowed, and almost everyone, I would learn, was quietly calculating how a small shift in the court's balance might benefit them if Isara simply disappeared. Doran was the first person to test me. He was Isara's senior advisor, an older man with a soft voice and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a kindness, even when it was not. He found me in the training yard on my 3rd morning, watching me work through unfamiliar drills with a blade I had been given but barely knew how to use properly. "You handle that weapon like a man who has never held one before," he said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I handled other weapons on my own world," I said. "This one just takes some getting used to." "Interesting," he said, circling me slowly. "Her Highness has chosen an unusual guard. Tell me, Ethan Hale, what do you know of court protocol, of the 17 houses and their alliances, of the ceremonies that govern who may speak first in a gathering, or who may not be seated above whom?" "Nothing," I admitted. "Then you are, in every practical sense, useless to her, in the environment where danger to her is greatest," he said, still smiling. "The training yard is not where her enemies will strike. The banquet hall is, the council chamber is. Places you cannot read, cannot navigate, cannot protect her within, because you do not understand the language being spoken, beneath the language being spoken." I did not have a clever response for that either, not at first, but I filed the warning away, because I understood immediately that he was not entirely wrong. That evening, Isara attended a formal dinner with 3 visiting houses, and I stood near the wall behind her chair, the way her previous guards had always done, watching a room full of strangers exchange pleasantries I could not fully parse. Doran had been right about one thing. I did not understand the layered meanings behind every polite phrase, every careful compliment that carried a hidden edge. But I understood people. I had spent years learning to read the small things a person's body does, when their words are not matching their intentions, the tightness around the eyes, the stillness in a hand that should be moving, the half-second delay before a smile arrives. That, at least, translated across species better than anyone in that palace expected it to. It was a young lord from a rival house, seated 3 places down from Isara, who caught my attention. He was pleasant, complimentary, laughing easily at every joke told at the table. But every time a servant refilled the cups nearby, his eyes followed the pitcher a fraction of a second longer than natural curiosity would explain. And when the servant reached Isara's cup, his hand, resting casually on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly. I moved before I had fully decided to. I stepped forward and, in a motion I hoped looked clumsy and accidental rather than deliberate, reached past the servant to adjust a serving dish, knocking the pitcher just enough that a few drops spilled onto the tablecloth rather than into the cup. I apologized immediately, playing the part of an untrained foreign guard, unfamiliar with proper service, and the servant, flustered, replaced the pitcher entirely with a fresh one from the kitchen. The young lord's smile did not change at all, but his eyes did, just for a moment, and that was enough. Later that night, back in the private wing, Isara's physician confirmed what I had already suspected. The original pitcher, tested quietly and without ceremony, carried a trace compound that would not have killed her outright. Something slower, something that would have looked like a natural illness striking her down over the following days, far enough removed from the dinner that suspicion would never land where it belonged. Isara sat very still when she was told, and then she looked at me for a long time without speaking. "How did you know?" she finally asked, once we were alone. "I didn't know," I admitted. "I noticed. There's a difference." He was watching the wrong things at the wrong moments. Where I come from, that means someone is thinking about something they don't want to be caught thinking about. "Doran told me you would be useless at gatherings like this one," she said, "that you did not understand our customs well enough to protect me where it mattered most." He wasn't entirely wrong, I said. "I still don't understand half of what happens at these dinners, but I don't need to understand your customs to notice when someone is lying with their whole body while their mouth keeps smiling." Something in her expression shifted then, a kind of quiet relief that she did not try to hide from me. "You saw what an entire room of trained courtiers, raised since childhood to read exactly this kind of danger, did not see," she said. "That is not a small thing, Ethan." "Lucky guess," I said, though I did not entirely believe that myself. "I do not think it was luck," she said. "I think it is exactly why I chose you. You look at this palace the way an animal looks at unfamiliar terrain, without the assumptions everyone born here carries. You see the ground as it actually is, not as you have been trained to expect it to be." Over the following weeks, that pattern repeated itself in smaller ways. I learned to read the court the way I had once learned to read a battlefield, not by memorizing its rules, but by watching what happened when those rules bent under pressure. I learned which servants avoided eye contact when carrying messages between certain houses. I learned which guards lingered a little too long near Isara's private study. I learned that Doran, despite his early skepticism, watched me with something closer to grudging respect the longer I stayed useful. Isara, for her part, began speaking to me differently than she spoke to anyone else in that palace. Not as a servant, not entirely as an equal either, but as someone whose opinion she had started, cautiously, to value. She told me things she did not tell her own council. Small worries about the succession, about her mother's failing health, about a half-brother named Kale, who had spent years quietly building support among the border houses, while publicly claiming no interest in the throne at all. "He smiles too easily," she told me one evening, standing on a balcony that overlooked the mountain valley below, the twin moons of her world hanging low and pale over the horizon. "Everyone who wants something they are not supposed to want learns to smile easily. It is the first lesson this court teaches." "You don't smile easily," I said. "No," she agreed. "I never learned to fake it well enough to be convincing. It is, according to Doran, one of my greater weaknesses as an heir." "I think it's the opposite," I said. "Everyone else in this palace is performing something. You're the only one who isn't. That's not a weakness. That's the reason I believed you in that hallway, before I knew anything else about you." She was quiet for a long moment after that, watching the moons rather than me. "There is a phrase in my language," she finally said, "for the kind of promise you made when you repeated my words on the transport ship. It does not simply mean a guard's duty. It means something closer to this. If the night comes when everything is lost, and there is no reward left to gain by keeping your word, and no punishment left to fear for breaking it, you keep it anyway, because breaking it would cost you something no punishment ever could. It would cost you the person you decided to be when you said it." "That sounds like a heavy thing to ask of someone you just met," I said. "It is," she said, "which is exactly why I did not ask it lightly, and exactly why I have not regretted asking it of you. I did not know then how soon that vow would be tested in full. I only knew, standing beside her on that balcony with the mountain wind pulling at her braid, that whatever this palace threw at us next, I intended to be standing exactly where I had promised to stand. 3 nights later, Doran came to find me alone, his usual careful calm replaced by something sharper, something closer to fear. He told me he had heard whispers moving through the lower halls of the palace, fragments of conversation between servants who did not know he was listening, mentions of a gathering planned for the night before Isara's formal confirmation as heir, a night when half the palace guard would be reassigned to ceremonial duties elsewhere, leaving her private wing thinner than it had been in years. "I do not have proof," he told me, his voice low. "Only fragments. But I have served this house for 30 years, Ethan Hale, and I know the sound a conspiracy makes before it becomes visible. I am telling you, because you are the one person in this palace, with no old debts to any of the 17 houses. If I take this to the council, and I am wrong about who is involved, I may be handing our enemies exactly the warning they need to move sooner. And if you're right, I said, and we do nothing. His expression did not need to answer that question out loud. I found Isara in her study that same night and told her everything Doran had shared. She listened without interrupting, her expression carefully still in the way I had come to recognize as the mask she wore when something frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The confirmation ceremony is in 4 days, she said finally. If Kale intends to move before I am formally confirmed, while the succession is still technically unsettled, he would need to act soon. A death before confirmation is a tragedy that reshuffles the line. A death after confirmation is an assassination that would unite every house against whoever ordered it. Then we have 4 days to find proof, I said. Or we have 4 days to prepare for the possibility that proof never comes, and something happens anyway. She looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something close to real fear behind her careful composure. I have spent my whole life being told that this palace is the safest place in the Empire, she said quietly. I am beginning to understand that it may be the most dangerous room I have ever stood in. Then it's a good thing, I said, that you didn't choose a guard who was raised to trust this room either. She almost smiled at that, though the fear did not fully leave her eyes. By morning, she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken to me on the transport ship, we will know exactly what kind of night this palace intends to give us. Neither of us knew yet how literally true those words would become. The 4 days Isara had counted passed faster than either of us wanted them to. I spent every waking hour walking the private wing, memorizing the paths a stranger might use to move through it unseen, the service corridors, the narrow stairwells built for household staff, the old ventilation shafts that ran behind the stone walls from a time before the palace had modern climate systems. I found 6 ways into her chambers that no guard roster accounted for. I assumed there were more I had not found yet. Doran continued gathering fragments, careful never to ask the same servant twice, never to let his questions form a pattern anyone could trace back to him. What he brought me on the 3rd day was not proof, not the kind that would satisfy a formal council, but it was enough to turn my unease into something closer to certainty. A shipment of ceremonial ceramics had arrived from the border provinces 3 days early, delivered not to the main palace stores but to a private wing, controlled by Kale's household staff. Ceramics did not need to arrive early. Weapons disguised as ceramics did. I cannot bring this to the council, Doran told me, standing in the shadow of a support column outside the kitchens, his voice barely above a whisper. A misdirected shipment is not evidence of anything. Kale would simply say it was an administrative error, and he would be believed, because he has spent years making certain he is the kind of person people believe. Then we don't wait for the council, I said. We prepare for the night itself. With what? Doran asked. The palace guard answers to the crown, not to Isara personally, and the crown's captain has old ties to Kale's mother's house. If we move openly against him without proof, we may hand him exactly the justification he needs to claim self-defense against an unprovoked accusation. I understood then the trap Isara had described to me weeks earlier, the reason she had chosen a guard with no ties to anyone in this palace. Every path forward that involved the existing structure of this court was compromised somewhere, either by fear, by old loyalty, or by simple uncertainty about who could be trusted. The only people who could act without hesitation were the ones standing outside that structure entirely. That meant me, and it meant Isara herself. On the 4th night, the night before her formal confirmation, the palace held a smaller private gathering, a traditional evening meant to honor the heir before the larger ceremony the following day. Most of the standing guard had already been reassigned to prepare the confirmation hall on the far side of the palace, exactly as Doran had warned. Isara's private wing, usually thick with armored bodies at every junction, held barely a third of its normal watch. I stood near her through the entire evening, watching every face in that gathering, with a kind of attention that made my jaw ache from holding it steady for hours. Kale was there, of course, laughing easily, offering warm words to his sister about the ceremony to come. the picture of a loyal brother content with his place in the succession. I watched his hands the way I had watched the young lord's hands weeks earlier at that first dinner. They stayed relaxed, open, unhurried. He was better at this than the last one had been, or he simply had no reason to be nervous, because whatever was coming was not going to happen at this table. The gathering ended late, guests filing out through the main hall in small clusters, still talking, still laughing, unaware of anything unusual in the air. Isara retired to her chambers, and I walked the private wing one final time, before settling into the small alcove outside her door, where I had spent most nights since arriving at this palace. It was somewhere past the middle of the night when I heard it, a sound too small for most people to notice, a faint scrape of metal against stone coming from somewhere below the floor, from the direction of the old service corridor I had mapped 3 days earlier. I did not wake Isara immediately. I moved first, quietly, down the narrow servant stairwell that connected the private wing to the lower levels, following the sound, until it stopped somewhere near a storage chamber I had already checked and found empty days before. It was not empty now. Through a gap in the door, I counted 5 figures in dark, unmarked clothing, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained together for exactly this kind of work. They were unpacking crates, the same ceramic shipment Doran had flagged, except what came out of those crates were not ceremonial pieces at all. Blades, short-range energy weapons, and something that looked disturbingly like breaching charges built for quiet, controlled destruction, rather than open warfare. I retreated as carefully as I had arrived, my heart hammering against my ribs, and made my way back up to Isara's chambers as fast as silence would allow me to move. She woke the moment I touched her door, already alert, already reading the urgency on my face before I said a single word. "They're here," I told her. "Downstairs. Armed. At least 5. Maybe more I haven't found yet." She was on her feet immediately, pulling a robe over her sleeping clothes, her earlier fear replaced now by something colder and more controlled. "Kale," she said, not a question. "I didn't see him," I said, "but it's his household shipment, and it's positioned exactly where Doran warned us it would be. The guard roster," she started, "is thin, and we don't know who on that roster can be trusted," I finished for her. "Waking the wrong person might just tell them we already know." She looked at me for a long moment, and in that look, I saw the full weight of everything we had built over the past weeks settle onto both of us at once. "Then, it is exactly as I told you on the transport ship," she said quietly. "Tonight, we find out what your word is worth." "And what yours is," I said. "You're not helpless in this. Whatever training this court gave you, use it. I need you thinking, not just standing behind me." Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, that I had said it that way, as an equal rather than a duty. "What is your plan?" she asked. "We don't wait for them to come to us," I said. "A quiet breach only works if it stays quiet. The moment it becomes loud, every guard still in this palace comes running, roster or no roster, because nobody sits still through the sound of a fight in the heir's private wing. Our job is to survive long enough to make this loud." We moved fast after that. I gathered every weapon I could find in her chambers, most of them ceremonial, some of them actually functional, and gave her the sturdiest one, a short blade, meant for close defense rather than open combat. She took it without hesitation, her grip steady in a way that told me this was not the first time she had trained with a weapon, whatever Doran believed about her supposed weaknesses. We did not have to wait long. The first sign came from the lower stairwell, a faint metallic click that I recognized immediately as a breaching charge arming itself. I pulled Isara back from the main chamber door and into the narrow servant passage I had mapped days before, the one entrance into these chambers that had not been part of the original palace blueprints, and therefore the one entrance the intruders were least likely to expect us using against them. The charge detonated a moment later, a controlled, quiet burst that blew the main door off its frame rather than announcing itself to the entire wing. Through the gap in the passage wall, I watched 3 of the 5 figures move into the chamber, weapons raised, sweeping the room with the kind of trained precision that told me these were not palace amateurs playing at treason. These were professionals, likely mercenaries brought in from outside the 17 houses entirely, exactly the kind of hired hands that left no trail back to whoever had paid for them. I had one advantage they did not expect. I knew this passage, and they did not. I stepped out from the servant corridor behind the nearest figure and struck before he had time to turn, driving him hard into the stone wall with enough force to put him down without giving him a chance to call out. The second turned toward the sound, weapon rising, and I closed the distance before he could aim, forcing the barrel upward as it discharged into the ceiling. The sound finally, deliberately, loud enough to travel. That was the plan, working exactly as intended, and exactly as dangerous as I had known it would be. The third figure turned toward Asara instead of me, and for one terrible second, I thought I had misjudged everything, thought I had left her exposed while I dealt with the others. But she moved the way someone moves who has trained for exactly this moment, even if she never expected to need it, sidestepping his first strike and driving her blade into his side with a controlled, precise motion that told me every lesson this court had ever given her about survival had not gone to waste. He went down. She stood over him, breathing hard, her hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed, but her eyes were clear, focused, alive, in a way I had not seen from her before. "You're not helpless," I said again, and meant it even more than the first time. "Two more," she said, ignoring the compliment, already scanning the shattered doorway. There were 5. She was right. Before I could answer, the remaining 2 intruders came through the broken door together, and this time, they were not moving carefully. They knew the quiet part of their plan had already failed. Now it was simply about finishing the job before the rest of the palace arrived. I put myself between them and Asara, and for the first time since arriving on this world, I understood exactly what she had meant weeks earlier, standing on that balcony, describing the true weight of the vow I had made on the transport ship. There was no reward waiting for me if I won this fight beyond her survival. There was no punishment waiting for me if I failed beyond the fact that I would have broken the one promise I had chosen, freely, without chains forcing my hand, to keep. That was enough. It had to be enough. The first of the 2 came at me fast, and I met him with everything my body remembered from years of training on a battlefield far from this palace, blocking his first strike, turning his own momentum against him, using the narrow space of the corridor to keep him from bringing his full reach to bear. It was not clean. It was not the kind of fight that looks impressive from a distance. It was desperate, close, ugly, both of us bleeding within moments, both of us refusing to stop. Somewhere behind me, I heard Isara's voice, sharp and commanding, shouting for the palace guard, in a tone that left no room for hesitation, the tone of someone who had stopped hiding what she truly was the moment her life depended on it. I do not know how long that corridor fight lasted. Time stopped meaning anything the way it usually did, reduced instead to the next strike, the next block, the next breath. What I do know is that somewhere in the middle of it, the 5th and final intruder appeared behind Asara, having circled through a passage I had not thought to check, and for one heartbeat, everything I had built over the past weeks came down to a single question. Could I reach her in time, while still holding off the man in front of me, before that final blade found its mark? I did not answer that question with strategy. I answered it the same way I had answered the question on the transport ship, weeks earlier, before I knew her name, before I understood what any of this would cost. I moved. I broke away from the fighter in front of me, taking a glancing strike across my ribs that stole the breath from my lungs, and closed the distance to Asara in 3 long strides. The 5th intruder's blade was already arcing toward her unprotected back, and I did not have time to think about the correct way to stop it. I simply put myself where the blade was going to be, instead of where she was standing, and felt the edge cut across my shoulder instead of finding her spine. The pain arrived a half-second after the impact, sharp and burning, but it did not matter yet. What mattered was that Asara was still standing, already turning at the sound, already driving her own blade upward into an opening the intruder had left when his strike failed to land where he expected. He went down beside the others, and for a moment, the corridor was quiet except for our own ragged breathing. 4 down. 1 remained, the man I had broken away from, and he had used those few seconds to recover his footing, weapon raised again, watching us both with the flat, calculating expression of a professional, realizing his contract had already gone badly wrong. "You should have taken the money and walked away before tonight," I told him, my voice rougher than I intended, blood running warm down my arm from the cut across my shoulder. "Whoever hired you isn't worth what this is about to cost you." He did not answer. He simply came at us both at once, a desperate final push before the rest of the palace arrived, and this time, I did not have the luxury of a clean fight. I put myself in front of Isara again, ignoring the burning pain in my shoulder, and met him head-on. It was the hardest exchange of the night. He was fast, trained, and had nothing left to lose, which made him more dangerous rather than less. I took a strike across my forearm that would leave a scar I carry to this day, and another glancing blow across my temple that filled half my vision with a dull gray haze. But somewhere in the middle of that exchange, I found the opening I needed, the same instinct that had carried me across that transport hallway weeks earlier, and drove forward with everything I had left. He went down, and did not get back up. I stood there for a moment afterward, chest heaving, blood running from more places than I wanted to count, and then my legs finally gave out beneath me, exhaustion and blood loss catching up all at once now that the immediate danger had passed. I felt myself falling, and then I felt hands catching me, smaller than mine, steadier than I expected, and I looked up to find Isara kneeling over me, her own robe torn and bloodied, pressing her hands against the worst of my wounds, with a kind of fierce, desperate focus. "Do not you dare," she said, her voice cracking in a way I had never heard from her before, all that careful royal composure finally breaking apart under the weight of the night. "Do not you dare fall now, Ethan Hale, after everything you just did to keep me standing." "Not planning on it," I managed, though my voice sounded distant even to my own ears. "Told you, I keep my word." The rest of that night arrived in fragments after that. Disconnected pieces I would only be able to fully assemble in the days that followed. The sound of running feet, finally, the palace guard arriving far too late to help, but exactly in time to secure what remained of the corridor. Doran's voice, sharp with a fear he rarely allowed himself to show, calling for a physician. The distant, muffled shouting of a chamber being searched further down the wing, where I would later learn Kale himself had been found, not fleeing, but calmly waiting in his own quarters with a story already prepared about mercenaries acting without his knowledge, a story that fell apart the moment the palace guard found the remainder of the ceramic shipment still sitting in his private stores. I remember being carried, though I do not remember by whom. I remember Isara's voice near my ear at some point, quiet now, no longer commanding, simply present, telling me to stay awake, to keep talking, to keep proving to her that the promise I had made still had a voice attached to it. I do not remember losing consciousness fully, though I must have, because the next clear memory I have is waking in a bed I did not recognize, sunlight streaming through a window in a way that told me, before anyone said a single word to me, that morning had finally come. My shoulder was bandaged, tight and professional, my arm strapped against my chest to keep the wound there from reopening. Every part of my body ached in a way I had never experienced before, a bone-deep exhaustion that came not just from the fight, but from the sheer weight of the fear that had driven every second of it. But I was alive and breathing, and when I turned my head slightly, I found Isara sitting in a chair beside the bed, still dressed in the same torn and blood-stained robe from the night before, watching me, with an expression I did not have a name for yet. "You did not sleep," I said, my voice rough and unfamiliar even to myself. "Neither did you, technically," she said. "You were unconscious. There is a difference." "How long?" I asked. "Long enough for the sun to rise twice over the mountains," she said quietly. "You have been unconscious for most of a full day, Ethan. The physicians were not certain, for a time, that you would wake at all." I tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it, as pain shot through my ribs and shoulder in equal measure. She reached out without thinking, one hand pressing gently against my chest to keep me still, and then seemed to catch herself, pulling her hand back slightly, though she did not move it far. "Kale," I said, forcing the word out through the discomfort. "Under formal confinement," she said. The evidence in his private stores was enough to remove any doubt his supporters might have clung to. The confirmation ceremony has been delayed, obviously, but not cancelled. My mother, once she recovered from the shock of the night, made it clear the succession would proceed exactly as planned, once I am strong enough to stand through the ceremony myself. "And the mercenaries?" I asked. "2 survived your fight in that corridor," she said. Enough to confirm, under formal questioning, exactly who had contracted them, and exactly what they had been paid to accomplish. It seems my brother believed a confirmed heir, would be far more difficult to remove than an heir still technically unsettled in her claim. He was in something of a hurry. I let my head fall back against the pillow, staring up at the ceiling of a room I did not recognize, trying to piece together the full shape of what had happened over the past day. "I told you I'd keep you safe by morning," I said finally. "I suppose I cut it a little close." Something in her expression shifted then, the careful composure finally giving way entirely to something rawer, something that looked almost like the fear she had not let herself show during the fight itself. "You did not cut it close, Ethan," she said, her voice unsteady in a way I had never heard from her before. "You put yourself in front of a blade meant for my back. You do not get to describe that so lightly." "It's what I promised," I said, "on the transport ship, before I even knew your name." "I know exactly what you promised," she said. "I have thought of little else since that moment in the corridor. I have seen guards raised in this palace since childhood, trained since birth to believe their entire purpose was my protection, hesitate in situations far less dangerous than what you walked into, without a single moment of doubt. I told you, when I chose you, that I believed you would put yourself between me and danger, because I had already seen you do exactly that once, before you owed me anything at all. I did not fully understand, until last night, exactly how far that instinct in you was willing to go. I made a promise," I said simply. "Where I come from, that's supposed to mean something, even when it costs you everything to keep it. Especially then, actually. A promise that only holds up when it's easy isn't really a promise at all." She was quiet for a long moment after that, watching me with an expression I still did not fully understand, something caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, and something else I was not yet ready to name. "There is a reason," she finally said, "that the phrase I taught you on that transport ship does not exist in most languages spoken across the 17 houses. Vows here are made to titles, to crowns, to the idea of loyalty, rather than the person standing in front of you. What you gave me, last night, in that corridor, was something this palace has not seen in longer than I have been alive. Maybe your palace just needed an outsider to remind it what a promise is actually supposed to look like," I said. She almost laughed then. A small, surprised sound that carried more relief in it than humor. "Perhaps it did," she said. "Rest now, Ethan Hale. You have more than earned it. There will be time, once you are strong enough to stand again, to discuss exactly what comes next." I did not fully understand what she meant by that until the following week, when I learned exactly how much that single night in the corridor was about to change, not just for me, but for the entire palace, and for the fragile, uncertain relationship between her people and mine. It took nearly 2 weeks for my body to heal well enough to move without the sharp pull of stitches across my shoulder, and in that time, the palace around me changed in ways I could feel even from the confines of a recovery bed. Word of the corridor fight had spread through every level of the household staff within a single day, growing, as these things always do, into something larger than the truth, though in this case, the truth had needed very little exaggeration to sound extraordinary. Doran visited on the 3rd day, standing at the foot of my bed with an expression I had never seen on him before, something close to genuine humility. "I told you once," he said, "that you would be useless in the places where danger to Her Highness was greatest. I have rarely been more grateful to be entirely wrong about something." "You gave me the warning that made the difference," I said. "Don't undersell what you did." "I gave a warning built from fragments and guesses," he said. "You gave the rest." "There is a difference, Ethan Hale, between suspecting a storm is coming and standing in the rain to hold the roof up with your own hands." He paused at the door before leaving, and added, quieter than before, "The council has taken notice. Not all of it is entirely comfortable with what that notice means, but they have taken notice all the same." I did not fully understand what he meant, until the guard captain, the same broad-shouldered woman who had objected to my release on the transport ship weeks earlier, came to see me on the 5th day, standing stiffly at attention, as though the formality of the posture might make the conversation easier for her. "I misjudged you," she said, without preamble. "I have served this house for over 20 years, trained under 3 different heirs, and I have never seen a single guard, human or otherwise, do what you did in that corridor without hesitation, without backup, and without a single moment spent weighing the odds before acting. I owe you an apology for the assumptions I made when Her Highness first brought you into this palace." "You were doing your job," I said. protecting her from an unknown risk. I understand that better than you might think. Perhaps, she said. But I have also served long enough to know that unknown risks sometimes turn out to be exactly what a threatened house needs most. I would be honored, when you are strong enough, to have you train alongside my own guard, not as a curiosity from another world, but as someone worth learning from. That conversation, small as it seemed at the time, marked the first true shift in how the palace saw me, not as a prisoner elevated by royal whim, but as someone who had earned a place among them through the hardest possible proof. Isara visited every day during my recovery, though our conversations in those early days stayed carefully practical. Updates on Kale's formal trial before the full council, updates on the confirmation ceremony now rescheduled for the following month, updates on the slow, careful process of stitching the 17 houses back into something resembling unity after the shock of what had nearly happened. It was not until the 12th day, when I was finally strong enough to walk without assistance out onto the same balcony where we had once discussed the meaning of her vow, that the conversation turned to something more personal. Kale's trial concluded this morning, she told me, standing beside me at the railing, the twin moons faint and pale against the daylight sky. He will not face execution, out of respect for our mother, but he has been stripped of any claim to succession and exiled to the border provinces, far from any position of influence. It is, by the standards of this court, a merciful outcome. How do you feel about that? I asked. Relieved, she admitted, and exhausted. And something else I have not fully found words for yet. He was my brother, whatever else he became. There is no version of this outcome that does not carry a kind of grief with it, even when the alternative would have been my own death. I did not have a perfect answer for that kind of grief, so I simply stood beside her in silence for a while, letting the mountain wind fill the space where words did not quite reach. The confirmation ceremony has been rescheduled for 3 weeks from now, she finally continued. The full council will be present, along with representatives from all 17 houses, and for the first time in the history of this empire, a formal delegation has been invited from Earth as well. That surprised me enough to turn and look at her directly. Earth, I said. After everything, your empire wants to invite a delegation from the world you defeated in the war. Not defeated, she said, correcting me gently. Not entirely, and not in the way most of my court still prefers to believe. What happened in that corridor 2 weeks ago has traveled through every level of this palace, Ethan, and beyond it, into conversations I am not even fully part of yet. A human prisoner, with no training in our customs, no loyalty owed to our crown beyond a promise made freely and without coercion, put himself between an heir of the Caliph Empire and 5 trained assassins, and did not hesitate for even a single moment in doing so. There are members of my council who have spent their entire lives believing your people were beneath meaningful alliance. That belief has become considerably harder to hold on to. So this is political, I said. You're using what happened to me as an argument for something bigger. It began as something deeply personal, she said, meeting my eyes directly. You saved my life, Ethan Hale, more than once, and the second time, at a cost that nearly took your own. Nothing about what you did in that corridor was calculated for political effect. But I would be lying if I told you the effect has not been enormous, and I would be doing you a disservice if I pretended I have not thought carefully about how to make certain that effect is not wasted. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. A formal position, she said, not simply as my personal guard, though that role remains yours for as long as you wish to keep it. A recognized place within this court, with a title that carries real standing, not the empty kind Doran once warned you about. And beyond that, the beginning of formal talks between my empire and your world, using what happened between us as proof that trust between our peoples is not simply possible, but already, in one small corner of this palace, real. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of what she was offering settle over me. Weeks ago I had been chained to a bench in a prisoner transport, cargo being moved from one holding cell to another, with no expectation of anything beyond survival. Now I was being offered a place at the center of something far larger than either of us, a chance not just to keep one promise, but to help build something that might outlast both of us entirely. And if I say yes, I said, what happens to the vow I made you on that transport ship? Does it end here, once it's served its purpose? She turned to face me fully then, her expression softer than I had ever seen it. All the careful royal composure set aside for just this one moment. "That vow was never about serving a purpose, Ethan," she said. "You did not repeat those words because you calculated a benefit to yourself. You repeated them because, in that moment, you decided they were true, and you have spent every day since proving that decision was not made lightly. I am not asking you to end that vow. I am asking whether you would be willing to build the rest of your life around it, here, beside me, for reasons that have very little to do with politics at all." The wind moved between us, carrying the scent of the mountain flowers that grew wild along the palace walls, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I felt no hesitation at all in my answer. "I already told you once," I said. "I keep my word. If that means standing here, beside you, for whatever comes next, then that's exactly where I intend to be." 3 weeks later, I stood in the great confirmation hall of House Vel, healed enough to stand without support, dressed not in prisoner's gray, but in the formal colors of a recognized guard of the crown, watching Isara Vel kneel before the assembled council of the 17 houses to receive the crown that made her, officially and irreversibly, heir to the Caliph Empire. When she rose, the first thing she did, before any formal word to the gathered nobility, was turn and meet my eyes across the hall, a small, private acknowledgement meant for no one but me. The Earth delegation stood near the back of that hall, 3 representatives sent cautiously, uncertainly, to witness a ceremony that would have been unthinkable only a month earlier. I would learn later that my own story, retold and passed carefully between officials on both sides, had become one of the first small bridges between two peoples who had spent years seeing each other only as enemies across a battlefield. I did not become a guard that day simply out of obligation, and I did not stay beside Isara Vel in the years that followed, simply because a vow demanded it of me. I stayed because somewhere between that first desperate moment in a prisoner transport hallway and the long, bloody night in a palace corridor, I had found something worth protecting that had nothing to do with chains, or captivity, or the terms of my surrender. People still ask me, sometimes, what it felt like to wake in that unfamiliar bed after the fighting ended, to open my eyes and realize the sun had risen twice while I lay unconscious, and to understand, in that first quiet moment, that the vow I made without fully understanding its weight had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, been fulfilled. I tell them the truth. It did not feel like victory, not at first. It felt like relief, simple and complete, the kind that only comes after you have given everything you have to keep a promise that mattered more than your own safety. Everything else, the title, the recognition, the slow beginning of peace between two worlds that had once tried to destroy each other, came after, built carefully on top of that single, uncomplicated fact. I made a promise to a stranger in a hallway, before I knew her name, before I understood anything about the empire she stood to inherit. By morning, after the longest night of my life, I had kept it, and in the years since, standing beside Isara Vel through everything that followed, I have never once regretted the price it cost me to make certain that promise held.